Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the Soufan Center today for this discussion on the roles of cities in security and governance. My name is Noreen Chowdhury-Fink. I'm the Executive Director of the Soufan Center. For those of you who don't know us, we are an independent nonprofit organization focused on research, analysis, strategic dialogue, focused on security and governance issues. And it gives me great pleasure here to be joined by Eric Rosand, who leads the Strong Cities Network, and is a senior visiting fellow here at the Soufan Center, with Emerita Torres, who used to be a colleague at the Soufan Center and at the UN, and also with Jeppe Elbers, who is leading the Nordic Safe Cities network. I wanted to say a few words today because I recognize we are in for a very interesting discussion, but this was going to be against the backdrop of a very difficult and challenging news cycle. I know that for many of us, our thoughts are with the Ukrainian people and all of those suffering from this conflict. And we hope very much that the discussion today will also be able to explore some of the issues that that relate to how the impact of the war in Ukraine is going to affect the roles of cities. But I'd like to get right into it and start this discussion. We're here today because Eric, Emerita, and Jeppe have all been working on the roles of cities as, their own actors in security, in governance, in diplomacy, and have some, really great examples of how cities more and more are taking on this role, either in complementarity to national efforts or in cases where perhaps national governments are less willing or able to take on certain roles, and certainly where there may be new opportunities for diplomacy across the board between cities. So I'd like to start with our speakers and ask a little bit about how you've seen this play out in your work. Eric, let me start with you. You've worked with us on this issue brief looking at the roles of cities in Africa in preventing and countering violent extremism. Can you talk a little bit about the work you're seeing with cities? Sorry, Eric, you're still on mute. In Zoom tradition.
Thank you, Noreen and the Soufan Center for organizing this, this conversation on this very important issue. I think the role of cities is gaining traction in more and more venues, platforms, and so I'm delighted to see the Soufan Center joining in that movement. So the Strong Cities Network is a global network of about 150 cities. We've been around for maybe 5 or 6 years, and it was initially set up in the height of the ISIS phenomenon to look at what cities could do specifically in the context of that crisis. And over time, it's evolved into much more of a platform for engaging cities and supporting cities and helping them understand a range of threats and challenges they're facing in their communities and how they can leverage their existing resources and tap into new ones to address them in an integrated way. And so the issue brief that I wrote for the Soufan Center really focused on the situation in Africa, and which is sort of an untapped venue for engagement with cities on these security-related issues. And I think if you just look at the context in Africa right now, with what's going on, whether it's in Ethiopia, Sudan, Burkina Faso, the police brutality that keeps reoccurring in Nigeria, and the continued over-militarized approach to addressing terrorist threats, the growing awareness of the connection between weak and failed states and limited governance and other political violence underscores the need for change. And typically when you're talking about change, you start at the national government level, except in Africa and other parts of the world, you're seeing increasing authoritarianism, increasing separation between central governments and interests and communities' interests. And this begs the question of, are there other avenues for engagement if we want to move the needle on some of these issues in a positive direction? And I would argue that there is at least one other avenue, which is cities, and particularly in Africa, where you see such a population growth in African cities. I think 9 of the 20 most populous cities in the world will be in Africa by the end of this century. And engagement there may offer a more direct and promising means to address some of the most pressing human security concerns. The added value of cities, I think, are pretty well known. They're closer to the ground. They understand the needs and concerns of their citizens. They're already trying to address the practical needs, day-to-day needs of their citizens. They're typically less risk averse and more agile than central governments, in part because they don't have a choice but to deal with the problems that they're confronting on their streets in some way. And where there are obstacles to engagement, they have to work around them. And so I think while they're able to build that trust with communities more effectively than national governments are, they're often cut out of conversations around security issues by central governments. They often don't understand necessarily what the specific threats from a national security perspective are in their community. They don't have access to data and the like. So what we're trying to do in the Strong Cities Network with support from the European Union is really double down on city-led efforts in addressing security and governance issues in Africa, starting with a mapping of African city needs and capacities and priorities across the continent, recognizing that there has been a lot of work done so far in Africa in sort of a project by project basis, whether it's in the state of Kano in Nigeria, for example. There you've seen a real movement towards creating opportunities for citizens to influence the spending priorities of local government and then to hold it accountable. So it's a participatory budgeting process that has both implications for security and for governance. And you've seen in Tunisia, in a suburb of Tunisia, the Open Street Map project, which allowed young people to contribute to the development of a map for local authorities that includes points of interest for young people, which are often excluded from traditional mapping of communities. And it can pinpoint problems in the community, such as lack of street lighting, which of course is a basic service requirement, but is also can tie into some security challenges. So the issue for us is how do you elevate those examples? How do you scale them up? How do you get city governments to be more to owning these initiatives and central governments to allowing for these initiatives to grow? And then for the donor community that's investing in Africa to really start prioritizing city level investments, not just around traditional development issues, which is already happening, but in this crossover between development and security, which I think needs to start happening more. So that mapping project will be finished in September. We'll be producing a report at the UN General Assembly in September that we hope will then catalyze even further engagement on the continent. So I'm happy to continue this conversation, look forward to hearing from others, but that's a flavor of what we're doing in Africa.
Thanks very much, Eric, and thanks for sharing some concrete examples. I think it's helpful to have those case studies. And of course, in many contexts, cities also more directly control law enforcement and security in the city. And that means that where we've seen reports of negative interactions between citizens and the security sector, which we have seen in research is a driving force of sort of grievances and violent extremism in some cases. That's a very important lever that cities also have in many contexts. But Amrita, let me also turn to you next. You've written about New York, cities like New York, particularly where the Soufan Center is based, so it's our home turf, taking on a more proactive diplomatic role given some of the unique placement and opportunities it has. Can you talk a little bit about that perspective?
Sure, and thank you so much to the Soufan Center for hosting this important discussion. So, yeah, I mean, I think what became really apparent to me in terms of this lack of a connection and strategic connection between cities and the international sphere, if you will, was the pandemic. I was a former diplomat. I'm locally elected in my neighborhood in the Bronx, and New York was the epicenter of the pandemic. The Bronx was at one point the epicenter of the pandemic. And you may be aware and recognize that the previous administration took a really long time to coordinate. In some cases, it simply did not from a federal perspective in terms of providing PPE, resources, and the like. And so it was really up to city and state and local actors to convene and to intervene during the pandemic. And what we saw here locally was we were getting actually a lot of international donations of PPE, of resources and the like. So in my neighborhood, we were receiving donations from several countries, actually, and we were coordinating that from associations, from international business associations and the like. And so I saw this as one of the many global megatrends, whether we're talking urbanization, climate change, pandemics, because we're likely to see, future pandemics. Hopefully not in our lifetime again, but we're likely to see those. Mass migration, displacement, the expanse of social media. All of these have both a local dimension and a global dimension. But I find that we're missing the local strategic part. We're missing the engagement with communities and understanding the dynamics that are taking place on the ground. And in this respect, I feel like the traditional diplomacy that we're so used to between national government and national government, or multilateral governments, is simply not enough. It's important and it's necessary and it's imperative, but it's not enough. And I don't think it's enough for the national security challenges that we face, talking about cyberspace, cyber attacks, mis and disinformation threats. These are all local phenomena as well as global phenomena. And if we don't have cities involved, we're missing strategic parts of the conversation and strategic parts of the solution.
Thanks very much, Amrita. That's a great entry point, and I know there's a number of points you've raised. It'd be great to come back to in the discussion. But Jeppe, I'd like to turn to you to hear a little bit about the work of Nordic Safe Cities and where you see the role of cities evolving in your work.
Thank you, Noreen, and also thank you very much for the invitation to take part in the conversation today. I'm joining you from Copenhagen, Denmark, and Nordic Safe Cities is a regional city network, also like the Strong Cities Network, born out of the height of 2015-16 ISIS and radicalization conversation, but today is assembling around 20 Nordic cities, primarily the bigger capitals in Scandinavia, cities in Scandinavia, and helping them prevent and counter extremism, radicalization, and hate. The initiative here is born in the governments, the Nordic Council of Ministers, and today is I'm leading the initiative as an international NGO. I think in terms of the role of cities, Eric and Marisa and you pointed out, I think very clear kind of the aspects of why cities matter and how they can contribute, particularly to the conversation around safety and security. Here in Scandinavia, I think the conversation around the national and local collaboration or alignment of strategy and conversation communication, it's working quite well. There are issues, but the crime prevention mechanism and system here was actually born locally in the 70s, and the mechanisms around safety and security are very embedded in the national level as well. So the conversation and compared to other parts of the world, I think we have a very strong multilateral collaboration. I think that's one of the things that Scandinavia is mostly renowned for in the conversation around extremism, polarization, some of the mechanisms and systems here. Of interest today, perhaps just to share some of the things we're doing. We are primarily supporting local stakeholders in their safety and security work. So that's mayors, law enforcement, and civil society and municipality. And we just did a survey in November and have been talking to all our members the past 3 months to unfold and uncover what are the priorities at the moment in the Nordic region in this field. And maybe I can share some of them and we'll get back to them. But at least what we're trying to improve here and what is some of the emerging things where city have a special voice and can do something at the ground is particularly around safeguarding local democracy and some of the issues that you have obviously seen in the States. That's a big priority now with the Swedish elections and elections coming up in Finland and Iceland as well. There's a big focus like all around Western world and everywhere around ensuring safe digital cities. So the work of online analysis and improving the digital mindset of ordinary prevent workers, social workers, school teachers who have been in the field for a long time, getting them to understand and act and adapt to a digital way of life. So that's a big priority, the priority, if I can say so, here. And then the conversation around avoiding or counteracting financial, economic, social segregation, having cities where there are no ghettos, you can say so. That's also a big conversation at the city halls in the capitals of Scandinavia. These were just some of the priorities working on here. And obviously at the moment, it's the conversation around Ukraine and the conflict in Europe that's at the top of people's minds.
Thanks, Jeppe, also for giving us a very comprehensive view, but also, some very specific examples. I'd like to turn to all three of you with a question based on some of the stuff you're saying. I mean, Jeppe, you're describing a scenario where cities are very much in lockstep with national authorities, but Eric and Emerita, you've also discussed areas where cities may be, if not contradicting national authorities, but then there's a disconnect between the city and the national objectives or capabilities. And I'd like to ask you guys, what do you see as the value added or the comparative advantages of cities where a state is either not willing or not able to kind of act on some of the security or governance imperatives, or where there's a real risk that the city is actually in contradiction to a national authority? Have you seen examples of that play out? Or have you seen how cities have overcome that potential tension? Eric, I'm looking at you. If this was a real table, I could make eye contact. But any of you, if you'd like to come in also, please raise your hand after.
Thank you. That's a very good question, and I think there's no single answer to it. I think if you look at the basic examples that I provided in terms of in Tunisia and Nigeria, the central government is not known for being the most transparent, the most balanced in terms of its approach to on security. And it's a federal system. States happen to have, in Nigeria, happen to have a fair amount of authority in terms of taxation, in terms of budgeting. And so there are opportunities there for the state to deviate from what the central government's doing. But it's really going to depend on who's the governor. Is it of the same political party as the in Abuja? And sort of the dynamic in the city itself. Is it a sort of a minority majority city, or is it a majority minority city? What kinds of tensions are in the community? And then if you look at in Tunisia, again, there's no way that the central government, which is very focused on the security aspects of dealing with terrorism and violent extremism, is going to be able to come up with very micro programs that address specific community needs. They might not be even aware of those programs, let alone those needs. So there are opportunities for direct engagement with cities by donors, by development actors. They're already in cities. There's tons of development assistance being channeled to cities more directly. It's just not often around the security space. And so I think that for me is one issue. And then finally, I think if you look a little bit north in North Macedonia, there is a clear example of where the political leadership in a city and at a regional level in a very sort of politicized world matters. So if you have an opposition mayor, opposition party mayor leading a city, it's going to be very difficult to establish a strong relationship with Skopje. Vice versa, if you have a similar political party as the mayor, then it's going to be, you're able to navigate that. I think the last point I'll make is often when you have an authoritarian government, it's very centralized governance, and at least on paper. But often they don't have, they're parts of their country that they don't have great access to, they don't have great control over. And so there are, again, opportunities to target engagement at a local level. But I would just conclude by saying it's very, very case by case, and it's very, it's difficult to draw a single conclusion on, or a single answer to the question.
Thanks, Eric. And Marita, we've seen, certainly in the climate change space, for example, cities take a very, some cities took a very different tone from the national government in the US. And we've seen increasingly cities try and take this diplomatic role as an entity, in the international stage. And you've written with some recommendations on how you see, for example, New York taking on more of a role as a diplomatic actor. How do you want to talk a little bit about your recommendations on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think just to comment on what Eric mentioned, I think there's always going to be like sometimes a healthy tension, other times a more dangerous tension between cities and federal governments. But I do think that when there's alignment on policy, it can be a real force multiplier in terms of engagement, in terms of progress. And when there's not, it becomes more difficult. But I think, as you mentioned, Noreen, climate change, pretty significant during the Trump administration when then President Trump was pulling out of the Paris Accords. Not just New York, many cities, many mayors stepped up to the plate and signed onto their own individual agreements as cities, and also made pledges to fulfill their version or their interpretation of standards with regards to climate change. And so we saw that. We also saw many cities coming up with their own local review mechanisms for international agreements. And that includes the SDGs, that includes the Paris Accords and the like. So you've seen a lot of mayors and governors also interacting in international groups, the Mayor's Council on Migration, C40, Nordic Cities here with us. There's so many different groupings. I want to say there's over 100 different ones, many of which are international, where they pull mayors and governors together to have strategic conversations. And so I think, climate change is certainly one. I could see policing and general, security issues around policing being an international, it already is an international issue. I could see mayors and governors coming around that to share best practices. New York crime is up, and we're looking for ways to, think about police reform. And so that's a critical issue.
Thanks, Amarita. Jeppe, you mentioned a number of your constituents, thinking now about the impacts of the war in Ukraine, and that was a question I wanted to come to. Broadly speaking, what the war is showing us also is a kind of reassertion of the centralized state and the heavy militarized arm of the state. And certainly from much of the rhetoric and analysis, it doesn't look like that will go away for a while. So there may have been an intervening period where we look for more diffuse centers of power. But now we're seeing kind of this resurgence of the state. And we do know that in the past, the anarchical society in many ways existed, right? You had city states, you had state-to-state diplomacy, governance, alliances, things like that. But now that we're seeing a centralized state come back, how do you see the impact of the conflict? I'll leave the question on the table though, because I see Eric's hand up and I just wanted to check if that's in response to Amarita's comment.
I can go after Jeppe, it's fine. Thank you.
So Jeppe, if you want to talk a little bit maybe about how the cities that we're working with are kind of seeing the role against a background where the state is kind of reasserting itself as the key actor.
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for you yet in terms of that question. I had one comment to the previous question, just to reflect here, where actually what we've seen in Scandinavia in terms of the national local dimension is that sometimes in Sweden, for example, in 2016, you had a mandate that every city to have local action plans. You had generic and general template rolled out over Sweden. An issue here. Do you hear me?
Jeppe, you're just going in and out a little. If you could just restate your last couple of lines.
Sorry, yeah. Okay, I was speaking about Sweden in 2016 and just the idea that you can micromanage too much from a national level, even though you have good intentions. There was a mandate that all Swedish municipalities had to have a local action plan. And research has shown that a lot of these plans did not take action in what was actually the issues, because they were making generic plans based on a security conversation around Syria. And some of them had they had the opposite effect, because they were securitizing agendas and minorities with a conversation, for example, around mosques, etc. That's just one of the things I think that has been an issue here in Scandinavia in terms of what could be improved in national and local level. But in terms of the Ukraine question or the emergence of nation states here, what I can say from Scandinavia is I've never seen this amount of social cohesion and cohesion between cities and the states and civil society, mayors, governors, and the government here in my lifetime. In terms of support for Ukraine. And one could think there was a kind of social cohesion around standing against the pandemic, but this is tenfold that. So this is just my initial thought around the moment as how we'll see it and what it's more everyone's together, both the country, the city stakeholders and the government, despite of the political parties here at least. And I think the ones trying to promote, for example, a Russian narrative around the conflict right now, trying to put it into maybe anti-vaxxer initiatives or trying to promote it somewhere with misinformation, it's not a good agenda to have here because everyone's ended. So that I think would be my initial commentary to the ongoing crisis here.
Thanks, Jeppe. And that's, I'm sure we'll come back to a couple of more questions on the impact of the conflict. But Eric, let me turn to you. And then also I'll just turn to Amrita after Eric to elaborate a little bit on the recommendations that you wanted, that you had put forward in your pieces. Eric, the screen is yours.
Thank you. I just want to, as we're talking about cities and all the different things they could be doing and are doing in different parts of the world, it's important to remember that the authorities of cities varies often from country to country, and the mandates that cities have, the extent of devolution that exists in terms of power in a country, it will vary. So one can't expect necessarily the same thing from a city in one part of the world as in another part of the world, simply because the domestic constitutional system or whatever just doesn't provide cities with as significant a role. And the other point I would just mention is that I would actually push back a little bit on the notion that we're seeing in general a rise in sort of emphasis on centralized sort of central government roles in sort of the international system. I think there's yes, in some cases, as with the invasion of Ukraine, obviously it's a stark example of that. But I think if you're looking at how we think about so many of the global threats and challenges that we're facing today, the general consensus is more or less that it's local in terms of the solutions. And I think one of the challenges we face is, how do you connect these two worlds? How do you connect the world of intergovernmental discussions at a multilateral level between national governments, and then all of these city networks that are sprouting up? And I think one of the things that we're working on in the Strong Cities Network is a very bureaucratic sounding name on that. We call it national local cooperation, and how to strengthen it. How do you get dialogue between central government and cities going? How do you get cities involved in multilateral conversations that have been traditionally dominated by central governments? How do you get central governments at the table in city level networks? And I think it's these interactions that are going to be a trend going forward more and more. And I think in every field that we're talking about where there is a sort of global dimension and a local dimension. And so I think that's something to look out for in sort of the city, the global city discussions.
Thanks, Eric. That's a great segue, because I was going to turn to Amrita and ask if you could just elaborate a little bit on the recommendations or the ideas you had put forward for example, New York as a city, as a diplomatic actor. And I think that that follows very well on what Eric was just highlighting.
Absolutely. I'll talk. So I mentioned a couple of things, a couple of recommendations. I'll talk about one around public safety and security. And we know cyber attacks are on the rise. So many people are engaging in remote work on our computers. And it's always like us today. And so, the threat to online safety and security is growing and growing. And in New York, at least, we also have cybersecurity gaps across, from positions being unfilled to knowledge gaps and the like. And we've created in New York the first of its kind cybersecurity defense center, where we're working with local partners, private partners, international partners to really share information, including law enforcement and the like, to share information around what's happening in the cyber world, to kind of track threats, mitigate threats and the like. And so I share this to say that we need to be developing these kinds of defense centers in cities around the world, because things like our local elections, easily hackable, easily. We've seen this before, it's happened, we've seen this story before, especially local elections. And I'm talking, not just, imagine a local election in a, in a conflict, but imagine, even a local election in a neighborhood. These election districts are small, we don't have a ton of resources. And, given what's happening, the conflict, I wouldn't be surprised if we are a target of future cyber attacks, small or large. The other thing I'll say, just to piggyback off of what Eric mentioned, is what we really need is this connective tissue between cities and states and the federal government. We don't have that. And so you have all of these sort of organic networks forming, which are fantastic. But at least from the US perspective, something that we're pushing for is new legislation that would actually create an office of subnational diplomacy within the State Department to start taking advantage of some of these relationships and opportunities. And the idea is not to federalize city and state interaction. It's more to kind of create the space for dialogue and to have the conversations. Because I think there's always going to be, again, like a healthy tension. But the idea is not to bureaucratize essentially, but to create the channels that would allow for dialogue and sharing.
Thanks. Thanks for that. And always good to have some concrete recommendations to follow up so we can pick up this discussion hopefully in a couple of months and see if or how we've been able to move forward on some of these recommendations. Jeppe, I'm going to turn to you for a second. You mentioned, the war in Ukraine certainly prompting this tremendous outpouring of cohesion and solidarity and kind of connectivity on the city and national level. And we're certainly seeing, for example, the government statements in Denmark about, supporting volunteers going to Ukraine and supporting the outflow of civilian support or, otherwise to Ukraine. But I wonder, we've had previous conversations on rehabilitation, reintegration, returnees, the big question certainly, around ISIS conversations we were having 2016, 17, 18, returning, relocating fighters, right? And things like that. Do you think cities and states are preparing not just for the outflow, and possibly the closer you are, bigger outflows than you imagined, for individuals joining ISIS, but also a return. And it doesn't mean that they're returning to do harm at home, but, individuals who may be traumatized by war, have other needs and things like that. So I wondered if or how cities are thinking, not just at this stage about outflow, but possibly returns.
Very good question. I mean, the foreign fighter I mentioned, I think the narrative has completely changed here. At least now they are heroes and not terrorists, if you can say that in one sentence, in terms of how it has been perceived with the people who went to Syria. The Prime Minister of Denmark said that you can go now. Until today, it was illegal to go to a conflict zone. I don't even know what changed in the legislation. I just saw the headline here earlier today. So definitely, the question will be, how do you, what are you going to do when people want to go to Yemen or Sahel or in the future, and how is it defined in terms of going there? I don't know the scope yet, but that's the conversation has completely changed in terms of fighting for democracy in something of a relative nearby country. Also, the refugee conversation, it's the same. Changed. Cities are opening the doors. I saw that the mayor of Aalborg, the fourth biggest city in Denmark, they already had refugees coming, didn't have the legislation, the national legislation in order yet, but the tone is that we need to adapt. And also the idea that you are helping refugees in the neighboring countries, which is the strategy of all the Nordic countries, that would be Poland and in the countries around Ukraine, that's very much kind of aligned with the strategy. So there's a willingness to do everything, let people go and in some form invite people in within the legislation. And obviously this has spurred in the kind of in the groups online with minority people. Is this outright xenophobia? Is it because they are white, not brown? And this general conversation around who do we want to let in? So that is something that's going on. We can see at the moment, and maybe some groups will exploit that to try to sow a little bit of division in terms of what kind of refugee are you. Obviously, this would be a conversation in many countries, but it's at the moment it's difficult to be a far right extremist in Scandinavia, trying to kind of be pro-Russia and have these conversations and try to polarize from that from that side on, because there's simply too much love for Ukraine and their cause and their stance at the moment. Yeah, I think that was just some of the reflections at the moment in terms of the ramifications of the conflict here.
Sure, and I know it's early days yet, but I think that, you know, we certainly have so many, certainly collectively, you know, us on the screen and many of the networks we've worked with and folks, there's so many lessons learned and things to be thinking about, you know, about the future. And, you know, we know some of the lessons learned and things to look out for. Certainly in terms of outflows, one of the key differentials, of course, we see is that many are asking to travel in support of, you know, not a hostile actor, it's an allied actor, right? So I think that's very important. And of course, for many, there is not going to be a very easy kind of, there isn't a legal problem in traveling. It's what you do once you get there that will raise questions. But I think there's quite a lot for us, you know, collectively to draw on. And I'm, you know, wondering at what point that conversation kicks in about returning combatants. The refugee question is a whole other one. And I think you've raised all the salient points and certainly some of the critiques about the differences in tone. Eric, your hand is up. I was going to ask you a question directly, but I'll come to you. I'll come to that.
Yeah,
after.
no, I think not to say that the specific situation we're talking about isn't important, but I think the bigger issue is ensuring that cities have the capacity to deal with these kinds of issues in general. And I think, you know, Nordic cities are probably better placed than most cities around the world to absorb refugee flows, to absorb returning fighters because of the tremendous resources and capacities they have developed at the municipal level across a whole range of services. The issue is where you have cities that don't have those capacities, but where they're going to be confronted with either mass migration or individual returning fighters and families. And I think one of the things that we're doing in our network is to try to help more cities understand how they can tap into existing resources, existing programs to deal with these kinds of often unanticipated challenges. So it's really the institutional capacities that I think cities need to focus on, and external partners need to focus on building these capacities, not just for a crisis that you know of, but to prevent future crises and to deal with crises that you can't anticipate now. And I think it's many of the same services, institutions, mechanisms that can be applied to all sorts of issues. And it's getting the stakeholders to invest in a sort of a integrated kind of program that can support all sorts of different kinds of needs as they arise. And I think there are examples of that, obviously, in across the Nordic region. And one of the challenges has been, how do you apply those lessons and those kinds of examples in less developed context, less democratic environments?
I think that's absolutely a key point. Like a lot of the things we're saying are about, you know, areas where these kinds of programs and initiatives are feasible. You know, how do we manage when they're happening in contexts where it's not? And certainly, Eric, you've highlighted a lot of opportunities there. But I had wanted to come back to you because you mentioned multilateralism, and you know, many of us have worked in the multilateral space in terms of responses to, you know, foreign fighter outflows to ISIS, and in terms of looking at PCVE and rehabilitation, reintegration. But a lot of those initiatives were premised on a form of multilateral cooperation, information sharing, and some level of consensus, even among, the permanent members of the council and states that are normally at odds with each other, that allowed for some international kind of collective efforts. We certainly see that consensus, deeply, deeply divided now, and I don't know that we'll see it, but put back together again in the near future. And so how do you see a role for multilateralism or international actors? For a little while, that was a bit of that connective tissue that Emerita was talking about. There were multilateral fora where these conversations were also taking place. So what do you see as a role for multilateralism in this space?
Before I answer that question, your last point, yes, there were multilateral fora where these conversations were taking place, but it was the perspective of cities, the perspective of civil society was always an afterthought. It was not, it was driven by central government, national government interests and requirements. But in general, I think, you look at the Security Council of the UN as one example, but I can't imagine that there'll be anything constructive coming out of that fora on these kinds of issues in the foreseeable future, and that will be back in the Cold War era where the council was sort of frozen, and that may not be a bad thing given the kinds of issues that we're talking about, and it may create opportunities for more city-driven multilateralism and for more national governments who are committed to multilateralism to actually rethink what that means. And it's no longer sort of just thinking about investing in the UN and traditional multilateral fora where Russia will be present, and it will be very difficult to do anything there on almost any issue of significance, and to start thinking about alternatives, whether existing alternatives or creating new ones, new platforms. And I think one kind of platform that needs to be created apart from these city networks is a multi-stakeholder platform for addressing local, these kinds of local security governance challenges that require central government, civil society, and local government as equal partners essentially in the conversation. And I think there's space for that, need for that, and hopefully there's resources for that, because I think that creating that kind of space that doesn't include Russia and China is going to be, I think, incredibly useful to actually make progress on some of these issues that we're talking about.
Thanks, Eric. Emerita, Jeppe, did you want to come in on the question as well? Okay. Well, we do have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm going to read them out, and then if you can raise your hand, or I can turn to you to see if you want to address them. The first question, and I'm going to read it out in its entirety so I don't miss the nuance. The question is, do you feel that a focus on improving basic reading literacy would affect these issues of local resiliency in a significant manner? Is that an overlooked link in local resiliency? Okay, Emerita, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think absolutely it's overlooked. I think, one of the drivers, or whether directly or indirectly, we're talking violence, violent extremism, poverty, lack of education, lack of economic opportunity, economic empowerment. We see in countries where violent extremism is high, low rates of literacy, low rates of education, low rates of economic empowerment. So there's obviously there's a relationship there, and improving local literacy, absolutely. And that's one part of it, of what I would think would be a comprehensive package. But certainly, yes, I agree.
And we've certainly seen that in areas of low literacy, it gives, malign actors, recruiters, others kind of disproportionate power too, right? Because it reduces the ability to challenge ideas, to challenge narratives, or to kind of see for yourself the different information out there. And we've seen that in different contexts, in a very sophisticated online space, but also where, young students, young kids are being told, certain religious or political narratives without the ability to challenge it themselves. So I think we've seen the question of literacy, security, recruitment to violent extremism or other malign forces certainly play a very key role in different contexts. But yeah, Eric, did you want to come in on that as well? Okay.
Well, I do. I would actually. I think we need to be careful about the literacy point because, for example, the United States has a very high degree of literacy, and we have a tremendous problem with extremism and hate and polarization. So I think, yes, it's an important point, but I think it's similar to the poverty issue. There's no direct correlation between poverty and violent extremism or terrorism. And I don't think there's a direct correlation between, I'd be surprised if there was a direct correlation between low levels of literacy and the kinds of threats that we're talking about.
And that also begs the question, when we say literacy, there are many ways of defining it and thinking about it. So we've certainly at the Soufan Center talked about sort of media literacy, education to young people about, digital literacy, critical thinking and all that. So yeah, certainly that's a very,
and maybe if you
point.
can't read so well, it's helpful because if you can't read disinformation, then you're not being influenced by disinformation.
There's that. Although that's what memes are for, right? I mean, the medievals had it right. Loads of people couldn't read. They had medieval memes up all over the cities and churches. But sorry, as a former medievalist, that does come to mind quite a lot. So, but absolutely fair point, Eric. There's a second question I want to make sure we also get a chance to talk about, because I think this is really important in many contexts. We will see it in Ukraine, but we've seen it in many others. In regards to local resiliency and what we've seen as a pattern of what happens post-conflict after the world moves on and there are power vacuums, how can Ukraine, Russia, Belarus region avoid malign participants gaining power after the Ukraine invasion is resolved, which is the big question, I suppose. But, what do we do when there are power vacuums? And I guess linked to our conversation about the roles of cities, and specifically given the war in Ukraine, how do you see a role for cities in the place of a power vacuum completely? We have talked about relationships with national governments, but what happens if there's a complete vacuum? If I got the question right, yeah. You're all dreading which one I'm going to pick on. Is that I feel a bit like I'm in the classroom, but I'm gonna I'll spin the dice. Well, let's hear from maybe Jeppe if you have some thoughts on that, and then
it will be thoughts, but I mean, I don't know if there will be a vacuum in terms of if Russia will successfully invade and it'll be a state like Belarus. They will be in charge of governing the country in some form. I don't know if there will be a vacuum before that, or we manage to keep the Russians away. But what the Nordic countries have been doing so far is to support civil society, support the democratic processes, support every kind of actor that works along the values and norms and institutions that we know here. So I guess that'll be the way to move forward. But I guess that'll be very difficult if Russia or another government is in charge of Ukraine. And in between this period and what will happen, I don't know. But the
big question.
Yeah.
Eric.
But for example, an example to do a Kiev Copenhagen exchange in 3 years, if Ukraine is on Russian hands, I see that would be very difficult to have any form of conversation. And will there be a new Iron Curtain with new countries, and how will that work, etc. So, yeah.
Extraordinary conversation we're having today. Eric and Marita, did you want to come in on that? But if not,
I don't have solutions, but certainly thoughts. I mean, I think the role of multilateral institutions may be important here, especially in terms of international mediation of some sort. I think may be important if we, once we get there. But who knows? I mean, it's so difficult to predict.
Yeah, I mean, and part of the challenge we know, and we're talking about outflows of civilian support, humanitarian support, and all the sort of good and important things people are doing for Ukraine and its people. But we also know that once these pipelines are set up, we can also get malign actors using them, and that there will be a range of people from a range of ideologies taking maybe advantage of these outflows. And so not all the civil society type activity we see may be things that ideologically align with some of the stuff we're talking about. We're likely to see, extreme right-wing groups and others take advantage also of these outflows and the dangers. So I guess I have a question to all of you. Do you see ways that cities can sort of start to brace themselves for the potential multiplication of actors? You know, the initial intention being humanitarian and supportive, and then what happens when we start seeing multiple actors go for different reasons, not, you know, not all of whom are going to go for the kind of humanitarian intention. And then another question, I'm just going to pose two more questions, and I'll do sort of a final kind of round robin if we want to talk about these. What issues does increasing the interconnectedness of cities, both internationally and nationally, pose for the future? Does it make security and resilience of cities actually more difficult? Because I'm presuming it alludes to the fact that with interconnectedness also comes more vulnerability and exposure. So what issues does increasing that interconnectedness have? And then one more question. We are having a by-election on the 26th of March, but political violence is scary and there have been youth deaths at rallies. How do we unite people and let them know that, you know, there are things to think about after an election? You know, elections are sometimes periods of violence and upheaval. You know, how do you make sure that cities and you know, constituents can kind of strategically think about post-election violence and managing that? And Marita, I'll turn to you for that question maybe. But interconnectedness of cities, risks, dangers. Eric, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I think there's always a risk when you're engaging with other cities or other communities. But I think the advantages far outweigh the risks in terms of learning and best practice sharing and understanding how other cities do it. I think is very beneficial, and I'm not quite sure I see the risks sort of materializing in a. It's not just going to be open-ended interactions. It's going to be targeted interactions where cities think they have something to gain and something to learn from a fellow city in another country. And the other point I would just make is before Marita is that often the challenge is that cities don't have the capacity or data or intelligence to be able to deal with the kinds of local threats, whether it's related to elections or other security related threats in their community, because there's not the conduit between the sort of intelligence and law enforcement capabilities and cities. And I just add that it's not just a sort of a global South issue. The city of Christchurch was not consulted at all by the central government in the immediate aftermath of the horrific attack in Christchurch, because the central government just didn't think that cities have any role to play on a security issue. The Christchurch call was issued, the very famous Christchurch call was issued without consent from the city of Christchurch. So we talk about these issues often in a conflict setting or in a global South environment, but they're sort of global in terms of their reach. No country is necessarily immune from some of these challenges.
Thanks. Jeppe, did you want to talk a little bit about whether interconnectedness increases the, you know, makes security and resilience more difficult, or if there are particular challenges?
I think I'm very much in line with Eric's points here, and I see whenever cities come to the table here, they have a tremendous interest in changing things, and they are not obliged to do things or be in international forums where some things don't make sense, or because they are bound by some international law. So if they want to, for example, progress on climate change or really work on their anti-discrimination strategies, I think they gain a lot from being more open, more connected, and especially when you see a city-led initiative, I think you have a lot of agility and momentum often, because it's something that makes a lot of sense directly to a mayor and to the people in charge. So you have more movement usually in these perspectives, I would say.
Thanks. Eric, did you want to respond to that? Okay. Emerita, do you want to come to the question of managing election-related violence or thinking beyond elections?
Sure. I wanted to quickly comment on the interconnectedness, if that's okay. I just think it's definitely going to take more effort, and it requires a different way of working. And I think that in and of itself, there's some resistance, there's some inertia, political resistance, maybe bureaucratic resistance to this new way of working, where you're working with cities and building that dialogue. But I also think at the end of the day, mayors, governors, local actors are first responders, they're crisis responders. So you're not going to see presidents flying down, immediately to an attack. For example, you're going to see the mayor show up. You're going to see some of the local actors show up first. And that's exactly, why it's so important that we have local actors involved in the conversation. But on the second point, I think, speaking from my community organizing, political background, it's not, I don't have a solution, but I think organizing is critical after an election. So, whether it's a win or it's a loss, local organizing and thinking around what's next, how are we going to organize ourselves for the next election is critical. And it's tough. I don't know the local dynamics taking place in Zimbabwe right now. But I think building local networks and thinking about the next election and trying to build some kind of a local infrastructure around what's to come is going to be critical.
Thanks very much. I see that we have about 4 minutes left. I wondered if any of you wanted to take 30 seconds to offer any sort of concluding reflections or food for thought going forward, or if there are any points that you'd like to raise on some of the questions we've talked about today. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I think on the point that Emerita was making, it's important to keep in mind the comparative advantage that cities have on prevention. And yes, the mayor is going to be often the first leader in the aftermath of an attack, but the ability of a city to respond and to an attack and sort of not have an attack sort of rupture the social fabric of the city is going to be determined by what it's done before the attack. And the social cohesion, the resilience building that is not crisis driven, but is to prevent crises. And I think that's often missed particularly by international donors when they're looking at cities. They're often in the security space, they're often looking at cities following something bad happening in that city, as opposed to helping cities on the preventative side to build that social fabric before a horrific incident affects that city, because then it's much better able to deal with it, not just from a first responder perspective, but from a community resilience perspective.
Thanks very much. Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to Eric, Jeppe, Emerita, the Soufan Center team, Amanda, who's been helping pull all of this together, and to our entire audience for joining us today and kind of joining us for this very out of the box conversation, which I think has really shown some important concrete examples about the roles of cities. And I think it is something that's only going to get more traction as we go forward. And I really very much look forward to keeping this conversation going with all of you. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for joining us today and see you again soon, I hope.